right, so you can do well with a budget deck. And today we're going to be taking a look at some decks that topped in recent weeks and are also very cheap to acquire. Chime in with your thoughts, as always, in the comments down below, and like the video if you enjoy it. And also let me know what you're going to be playing for this next format. So for the first deck, I wanted to talk about this deck list. It's from Utah Regional, and it's an Invoked Dogmatica list. So I did my nail calculations as always, and an Invoked Dogmatica core is going to cost you about $25. With the Pot of Prosperity, which you probably have to have for consistency, you're going to spend about $39 to $40 for this entire core. And the rest is just comprised of hand traps. This means that you're getting the entire Dogmatica engine together with Nadir Servant and everything when it comes to the Alistair side of things, as well as the extra deck, because most things are also really cheap. I also have to stress before we get deep into this video, obviously these deck lists play SP. If you can afford it, that's awesome. You know, that's an amazing addition for your deck. You're probably going to be able to win a couple games just off of SP alone because it is a busted card. But I don't think it's necessary for you to be able to compete at all, like at a basic level, if you know what I mean. It's going to be nice, but it's not of the utmost importance for you. So when we're talking about actual cores, I think you can do well with this deck, and it's also going to be really cheap. Now, why is that? We're overall in a very mid-rangey format, and there's a couple of combo decks here and there, of course, but you want to have a deck that's able to fit a lot of hand traps and also put a couple of disruptions on the board that are going to be able to slow down the game to your pace. And then you just do your Mekaba, do your hand traps, and you can also definitely disrupt your opponent that way. And I just feel like this deck is not a bad choice at all. We need to take a look at non-engine, of course. If you have Super Polymerization, that's amazing. You're going to be able to counter the meta because Super Poly is going to be one of the strongest tech cards moving forward. So I think this deck is the perfect example of what you can do with things you already have on hand. Both of these engines are fairly old at this point, so you might already own all of the cards. And if you don't, you're literally spending $40 to get the entire deck and extra deck, and the rest you can just fill up with whatever you want. There's Bishios in this deck list, which if you own them, that's nice. If you don't, you can just place, you know, like a random playset in there of Drow or Nibiru or whatever you want. And there's also Ash, Veiler, Impermanence, and the likes. But let's take a look at these cards actually. Like, Ash was reprinted in the 25th anniversary. Impermanence is literally a common from the Fire King structure deck, which is still kind of baffling to me, but you can do pretty much whatever you want in terms of non-engine, and that's going to be the case for every single deck on today's list. And I genuinely think this deck is something that's able to compete, and it's also not going to cost a fortune for you to do so. So there's that, and obviously when it comes to side decks, it's definitely going to depend on your personal meta, but I don't think you can go wrong with like a common Pancratops or like a playset of Cosmic Cyclones or Evenly Matched. Like, all of these cards are not expensive anymore, which is awesome. And I think Konami is definitely taking steps in the right direction when it comes to making staples much more accessible. So with that in mind, let's move on to the next deck. This one is a little more expensive, I gotta give it that, but for the entire Pearly core, you're going to be spending $150. And I'm talking literally the entire core. We have a deck list here, let me pull it up. So this is just pure Pearly, and I think this deck is kind of overlooked lately. And I also know that there's literally only Ding Kong Fam just pushing this deck to pretty much insane lengths, like he's going like 8-1 and stuff with Pearly, but that just goes to show that if you're a good player, if you know what you're doing with the deck, and the deck is also really good because Pearly honestly only lost a bit of consistency. If you know what you're doing, I think you should be fine, and this deck is actually quite well positioned in the meta. the consistency is just not really there sometimes, but you do play Prosperity for that. So if you also have to spend about $15 for a playset, which is literally nothing compared to what Prosperity used to be, you're spending about $166 for the entire Pearly deck. And of course, there's also staples, which we talked about already. You can include anything you want. If you have Zeus, play Zeus. If you have Sky Crisis, play that. If you have SP, obviously you're gonna include it, but you know, you're fine with just what your deck is able to do. And if you, for example, don't own every single card, because like Pearly is still like the most expensive cards are about $15 each or something like that, which we have to note is half the price of what they used to be. But if you don't have all of that, let's take a look at a deck list that just got top 4 at the Foggia Regional, and it's actually Pearly Sprite, which means that you don't have to play a playset of every single good card. Like Pearly is only at 2 copies here, and the Sprite cards have always been fairly inexpensive. Like Starter just went up a little bit because now it went to 3, but you only play 1 copy anyway in this deck list. So I think this just goes to show that, again, you can play pretty much whatever you want if you know what you're doing and if you really prepare for the format with your non-engine, which again comes down to whatever you own or are able to borrow or are just able to make it work in any way possible. And there's also cheap reprints like we already discussed. So I do think Pearly is not a bad choice, also because I personally am not of the opinion that this deck is getting hit on the ban list in the future. They did everything they could to Pearly, I think, or everything they thought they would. I don't think it's getting hit any further. So you're literally investing, not spending, about $150 to be able to play a competitively viable deck that rewards good gameplay for months to come. So this next deck is also a little over $100 for the core, and what I'm talking about is Branded Chimera. I definitely wanted to include a branded deck because it's just so funny how branded has been viable for literally years at this point. But if we're talking about the purest branded version possible, there's Quem and a couple of expensive cards, so I didn't really want to go into that. If you own these cards from before, that's amazing, but Quem went up significantly. So let's take a look at the cheaper version, which is the Branded Chimera. Literally the most expensive card in the Chimera deck is like the Fusion, the king of the mythical beasts, which is about $10. So that's not terrible. And then there's also Guardian Chimera, which you have to spend for. Garura, which is pretty much a staple at this point. So you are totaling at about $116 for the entire deck. But if there is a deck out there that's not getting hit and that's gonna be good, is Branded Chimera. Like at this point, I think there's like a community consensus that Branded Fusion is just not getting hit, ever, probably. Unless they hit every single top deck, and then they have to hit Branded Fusion, which is not happening because we have just so many good decks right now, and we're only going into a fire-dominated meta, so it's gonna literally take months before they address all of these quote-unquote issues and bust the cards. So yeah, I actually think this deck is definitely able to compete, and I do have to say that for this calculation I did not include Crossout Designator. The card is really good. It's definitely helpful in a deck that kind of lives and dies by just Ash on Sword Knight or Branded Fusion sometimes, but Crossout was about $5 or something like that when I acquired a playset, and right now obviously it went up in price. However, if you own these cards from before, you can definitely include them in your deck list, but they are not, I repeat, they are not mandatory, at least in my opinion. So I think this deck is able to compete. It's going to take some skill to pilot. However, I do think it's a nice contender, and it's literally $100 for the entire deck. I counted Branded, the extra deck, Chimera, obviously, and there is one SP here. If you want to play it, you can, again. And also Rinbrum is like $11 for some reason, which we're just not going to talk about that. But you're not spending a lot for this deck, and I do think you're able to do well, again, just for months to come, just like Pearly. So yes, there's that. Moving on to the next deck, number 4 on today's list. I had to give some props to Marincess. Like, why is a Marincess core $35 and you're able to top. It's just, I think it's amazing. I played Marincess for a short period of time, a couple months back, and I do think it's a fun deck to play. Let me pull up the deck list, actually. It's literally less than $40 for the entire core, and they got, let's see, top 8, I think? Yes, top 8 at the Klagenfurt Regional, which I do assume was a highly competitive event. So you're playing just Marincess cards and non-engine, which this deck just has a ton of space for, and you can play whatever you want. And I also don't think you're gonna spend a ton for 3 Pot of Desires, let's be real. Like, one of the most probably expensive cards in your deck is like the Dive, which is like $7, and you can play however many copies you want. Marincess deck lists overall just kind of vary in ratios from what I've seen. This deck list is not the end-all be-all of Marincess deck lists. However, I do think it's really, really solid. You're able to include Toad, which after a couple reprints is like less than $2, which is amazing. Zealantis as well is literally like $1.40 or $1.50 or something like that. And yeah, the deck is going to be in a weird spot. At times, it kind of loses to SP, sometimes loses to itself if it doesn't see Marincess cards, which in this deck list, I do think the Marincess count is a little low, but it worked out for this person, obviously, so you can build it however you want, and most importantly, you're spending $30 for a core, which is awesome. And it's kind of cool because it's a water deck and we're in a fire meta. It doesn't really matter. I just wanted to throw this out there. And the Marincess lock with Zealantis is really, really good, so there's that. So yeah, Marincess made the list. And as for the last deck, I was a little indecisive because there is a couple honorable mentions, which let's do these first. I wanted to mention Hero, which just got top 4 at Bogota Regional. Hero is not expensive. Like, just the fact that Phoenix Enforcer is $2 is funny to me, but yeah, you can play this deck and you're probably going to be doing well, or fairly well. It's going to depend on the setting, but sometimes Hero can just catch you off guard 100%. There's also Sky Striker, which I just love. I absolutely love the Goddess in this deck list. I think it's hilarious, but I love it. So yeah, you know, Sky Striker wasn't exactly doing consistently well, but again, top 8 at the Slea Regional is not bad at all. There's also Super Heavy, which Super Heavy Samurai was always cheap as an engine, but this is actually a pure deck. Like, there's only the Therium package, which is amazing. And then let's take a look at the extra deck. Like, nothing is really expensive ever since the Baron reprint, so I think this is fine. Like, access code, sure, but at this point, you probably own access code because it's just a really, really important card to have in the meta. Drytron is about $100 for the core plus the most important cards in the extra deck. And like Linkuribo is $8, which is like the shock of my day today. But yeah, you know, Nova is about 10 or 11. Like, it's not the cheapest deck if we compare the actual power of it and the price point. But if you own some of these cards from before, you should be fine. And the actual last deck on today's list, the one we're going to be talking about a little more in depth, is going to be Dark World, which is kind of funny because I always hate on the deck. But the Dark World core is going to cost you about $58. And let's pull up the deck list. For this core, I counted all the Dark World cards and also all the Danger cards because they're cheap at this point. And as for the extra deck, for the most part, you're just playing utility cards. There's Nightmares in there, Baguska, Dweller, Underworld Goddess. Like, the most expensive card is Apollousa, which is like $11, and everything else is less than that. So realistically, if you want to play this exact extra deck, you're going to be spending like $70 to $80 for the entire deck. And I do think that sometimes Dark World is going to be in a weird spot, to say the least. Draw, Nibiru, Bestios, Shifter, all of these cards do hurt the deck. But on the other hand, it's still able to do a lot. It's spamming the board with bodies. It's going to be able to OTK you fairly easily. It's hand looping you, which is really unfair. But yeah, you know, I think this deck is kind of like, if you know how to pilot it, you're going to have an upper hand a lot of times. Like, it's gonna take some skill to pilot Dark Road, but I do think it's nice because you're not going to be spending a lot for the deck. And also, if you have fun with it, I think that's really, really important. From what I've seen, Dark Road is just really loved by all the Dark Road players, and I think it looks fun to play. Like, there's all the RNG with dangers and all of that, and I think it's going to be a fairly decent deck in the meta, and obviously doing well, like getting top 8 at the Cancun regional, like that's nice. That's a really good accomplishment, and yeah, you know, $60 to $70 for a deck, not just a core, is fair. So I definitely wanted to include Dark Road on here and give them some love, since I never do. But yeah, that's pretty much gonna be it for today's video. Hopefully I gave you some ideas, and I just really want to emphasize how I personally don't think you should be feeling bad or discouraged in this meta, because there's a lot of viable options out there. You just kind of have to go out of your way a bit to find them. So I guess with that, I'm gonna end today's video, and if you enjoyed, of course, give it a like, and yeah, I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!